Good evening. At this time, we'd like to convene the City Council Finance Committee meeting for Tuesday, September 17th, 2024. Would the clerk call the roll?
Councilmember Vinker.
Here.
Chair Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Lowing. 2 present.
Thank you. All right. So we have an opportunity for members of the public to speak on items that are not on the agenda but are within the purview of this committee. Do we have any speakers?
We do not.
Okay, so we'll move on to our one item tonight, which is an action item to accept the California Public Employees Retirement System, or CalPERS pension annual valuation reports. Lauren, I assume you're taking the lead?
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chair. Lauren Lai, the CFO for the city. With us also is Paul Harper, our budget manager. Online with us is Kayla Shapiro, who's our senior management analyst, and also Matt Bigart, who is our CalPERS actuary. So thank you for putting up the slides. Tonight, we are transmitting to the Finance Committee the annual CalPERS valuation report for the period ended June 30th, 2023. Just so you know, the report is typically 2 years in arrear. So I wanted to explain why it's June 30th of 2023 as well, for those who may be new to this. Next slide, please. So the overview for this afternoon is that we are going to go through the report itself, and the purpose of this report is that it guides our fiscal 26 budget development and also our long-range financial forecasts. We'll go over several areas, in particular the pension funding sources. What are some of the trends and strategies in these various funding sources? The status of the pension plans, specifically the current and projected employer costs, the expected changes in future reporting, and some next steps in our budget development. And the goal this evening is to receive the CalPERS report for the period ended June 30th of 2023. Next slide, please. So when we look at pension funding source, CalPERS likes to represent it in what they call the pension buck. So this pension buck shows for $1 of pension benefit, these are the funding sources. So 56 cents or percent comes from investment earnings. 11 cents or 11% comes from CalPERS members, namely in the employees, and 33% or 33 cents comes from the employer. And that proportion is important because that tells me and those that are looking at the pension buck that investment returns has a greater influence on our funding source and our asset portfolio and our liability positions in comparison with those other two buckets. Okay, so next slide. When we look at those 3 buckets, I want to talk about what is the current position in those 3 buckets, and importantly is for the city of Palo Alto, what has been our strategy in addressing pension and what has been the outcomes, because the city has been very proactive in all those 3 categories. In the investment side, in the employee contribution, and in the employer contribution. All right, so let's first start with the CalPERS investment category. As you recall there, it says 56% of the pension buck comes from this category. And so this is driven by the CalPERS investment portfolio. We don't have control of this. For the period ended June 30th of 2023, the actuarial report shows that CalPERS had an earning of 5.8%. That's less than their discount rate, which is their investment target of 6.8. Good news in the little parentheses down below is for the year ended June 30th of 2024, we have a preliminary number of 9.3%. So that's good. As you may recall, the year prior, it was negative 21%, right? So we are showing and demonstrating some good recoveries from the CalPERS investment, and that's helping us. If we move to the CalPERS employee contribution, an important strategy in collaboration between us as the employer and the labor groups are the cost sharing agreements in our labor contracts. Employees contribute between 1% to 4% of that employer cost. In addition, we have multiple tiers of pension plans. So we have tier 1, tier 2, and PEPRA. What's really important here is, as you'll note there in that second green block, this year we have 60% of our staff in PEPRA. And so prior year it was 55%. So the more employees that start moving into tier 2 and PEPRA tier, the less expensive the pension gets. So we're seeing the outcomes of these state laws, okay? The third category, employer contribution. Now, employer contribution has two buckets, let's call them buckets. One is normal costs, which is the pay-go for current employee costs. And then also we have what's called the catch-up, which is the unfunded liability portion. That is a big flat amount. So that represents 33%. How the city has been proactively addressing this is twofold. One, we have set up a pension trust through the Section 115 section of the legislation. And two is we actually accelerate our contribution and pre-fund. I'm pleased to say that as of the report, we have $84 million in the pension trust. And that translates to improving our funded status by over 5%. And that's really important because when I show you the slide later, you'll see that that's actually making a difference relative to our pension funded status. Okay, so next slide, please. The report that's attached to this staff report for you in attachment A and attachment B and C are actually the actuarial reports for the safety plan and the miscellaneous plan. Highlights there you'll see is that there are no significant changes to the CalPERS actuarial assumptions. The employer contribution estimated for fiscal 26 is 68.6 million, and that's a combination of normal costs and a combination of paying down the unfunded liability. It's an increase of about 5.5% over prior year. The investment gain is 5.8%, as mentioned previously, compared to the target of 6.8%. Some of you may recall that the board has established a phase-in period for their investment gains and losses. There's a 5-year ramp up and then a 20-year amortization. And that's how they phase in the gains and losses. And so we incorporate that into the way we model our long-range financial forecasting as well. You'll see there in that bullet point, the fluctuation in gains and losses have caused some really great swings. So in the table right below, it shows the investment actual gains and losses compared to the target, the over and under the target, and the span over 4 years. You'll see, in fiscal 2020, it's pretty mild, 4.7. And in fiscal 21, we have this huge gain of 21%. And then in fiscal year 22, we have a loss of 6%. And so that loss there had a really big impact on the whole portfolio. And so we're recovering at 5.8 and then 9.3. What that does to the funded status down below, you'll see, is we go from 63.5 to 73. We lose that position and go back to about 64, and we stay at 64, right? So remember, the investment is over 50% of that pension buck. So the investment returns on the CalPERS assets is really important. And what we're doing in the pension trust account that we have locally here is also really important in terms of our pension strategy. Next slide. This shows us the normal cost and the unfunded actual liability as a percentage of payroll. So for safety plan, the pension cost is about 80%, mid 80% of payroll, and miscellaneous, it's around 40% of payroll. And this shows you over time, so it's fairly stable in that range. And again, as we get more PEPRA employees, that should also improve as well. And as the city continues to pay down that pension liability with that goal of 90% funded in 15 years, that will also stabilize and reduce these ratios to payroll as well. Next slide. So in this slide, what we're showing you is the unfunded liability for safety and miscellaneous. And I want to call your attention to the blue shaded area in the unfunded liability per the CalPERS report. And then if we add in the Section 115 trust, the unfunded or the funded status with that. So I'll call your attention to the last column, which is fiscal 26, which is based on the most recent actuarial report. We have an unfunded actuarial liability of 574 million per the report and a funded status of 64%. You'll see that 64% position hasn't really improved much when you look at 2022, right? But when you take into account the pension trust, our savings has improved over time because we've been very proactive with our fund balance and also the reduced discount rate that we have at 5.3%. So you'll see there that we've been contributing towards that, and right now we have $85 million. So that right there is improving our funded status by 5%. And if we didn't have that, as you could see there, our funded status really wouldn't have improved much for the last 5 years, right? So I wanted to demonstrate that for us to continue to monitor and track. And then in the policy, which council approved and adopted, we are going to study our pension every 4 years in alignment with the CalPERS ALM study. And so likely we'll undertake that in 2026. CalPERS is going to undertake their ALM study in 25. It usually takes a year or so, and we will subsequently follow up. We'll study to determine, if we should modify our policy and where are we on track with some of those goals, right? 90% funded within 15 years. What does that look like? And so we're continuing to monitor it and wanted to show you some of those successes. Next slide, please. So important also is to know what to expect or some changes that we're anticipating. So the 9.3% return for June 30th of 24 is favorable. That's great because it's above the target of 6.8, which means that it'll help our funded status and also help our liability position. The other aspect that's important also is the board decided that it's going to suspend the CalPERS risk mitigation policy slightly, in that previously, if the investment return was 2% greater than the target, the CalPERS discount rate would automatically decline by a ratio per the policy. In April, the board decided that the policy, any rate adjustments would be subject to board review. So the board will review this. The 9.3% would have previously triggered an automatic reduction. The board will review it, and if the board decides to reduce it, it would go from 6.8 to 6.75. That doesn't affect us too greatly because we're locally contributing more towards our Section 115 trust anyways, but I wanted to bring that to your attention. Also, importantly is that, our labor agreements all run through 2026. And so those have cost of living adjustment, market adjustment, and other terms and conditions. And fiscal 25's, staffing additions as well, that will, that is, 29 position or an increase of 2.7, FTEs. Okay, next slide, please. So kind of some of the next stuff administratively for us as OMB staff and also for the Finance Committee is in December, January, we will bring to you the long-range financial forecast, incorporating a base scenario and alternative scenarios. They will incorporate the information from this actuarial report and also incorporate some information and assumptions for the preliminary returns. In May, as you're familiar with, we'll bring to you the proposed budget, and in June, the committee would recommend the adoption of the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. That summarizes my report to the committee, and I hope you can accept the report, and we're here to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's see if we have any members of the public who want to speak.
We do not.
I suspected it wasn't a odd item. Vicky, do you have questions?
Sure. I have more just questions as I want to make sure I'm digesting this appropriately. And thank you for the presentation. I read through the staff report and it was nice sort of summary refresh. And I still have some questions that you've gone over, but I probably need to hear a third time. One is simply, I'm looking at table 3 in the staff report, which is CalPERS investment returns on page 10 of the packet. And it's just a simple question, but we were going through the numbers that you went through on our slides as well, and the actuals, and showing the fluctuation 21.3 and minus 6.1. Why are the fiscal years 24 and 25? And I'm guessing I'm looking at fiscal year 2026 and 2027 as having actuals, but we're in 2024. So I know what's going on there that I'm not appreciating.
Oh, yeah. It's the 2-year alignment. So, so if I understand your question, it's a little peculiar that we have numbers of investment returns when we haven't completed those fiscal years. So they seem a little off. So the June 30th, 2023 report, which is today's report, has the 5.8% return, and that's going to drive the numbers for fiscal 26.
Is it that those are the years, not the actual percent return years? Those are the years that it impacts us.
Correct. Correct.
So maybe we want to
change the header. Yes, thank you. We could do that. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And, or we could retitle those. So it's the year of the actual returns. That may make more sense, the latter, because then as we look at market fluctuation, a lot of us recall some of those big crashes during the COVID year. So I think the latter may make more sense. We should update the title, the headers to reflect the year ended for these returns. So we could do that. Thank you for that question and observation. Sometimes we're so close to the report, we don't even see some of these things anymore.
Well, I appreciate that. You know what you mean, but since I'm new to the lingo, I'm just trying to make sure I'm tracking. So that'd be helpful. Thank you. The other question I had, if we go up to the CalPERS current and projected employer contributions, table 2. And you also went through some of these in the slides. It just so happens my questions are on the staff report, so I'm working from that. And you took us through the percent of payroll, total ADC, and I'm just curious for safety, where in the out years they're all up in the 80s. And I think you made the comment that that those numbers, the total ADC numbers, will reduce as our pension liability is paid down. And I guess I'm wondering, like, they seem high and they're double, I think, the miscellaneous roughly, or some are in the 40s, these are in the 80s. how much do you think they would reduce if we stay on track and do our 90% by 2036 or whatever it is?
I don't know, Paul, if we have that information today. I know we have them somewhere, but I don't know if we have them right now.
And I-
Usually there's a chart that, so yes, maybe we can look and see.
And I'm not even necessarily looking for specific numbers. it's just such a huge percentage
Right.
of payroll that I'm just wondering what, roughly what range, what ballpark of
Right.
impact it would have if we get that pension down.
Typically, and we can find it somewhere, maybe not in this moment, and we can get back to the committee, but usually we have a line chart that shows that trend over the period of time, especially with some of our studies. So we have that.
Right. And Kylie Nose, Assistant City Manager, thank you for the question, Councilmember Vinker. The thing to think about of how those percentages are crafted, there's three inputs. There's your unfunded accrued liability, there's your normal cost, and then all based on what your payroll is. And so in theory, if nothing else changed and you had a flat mortgage rate, let's just call it that, you would pay off your mortgage in 20 or 30 years, which would in theory mean that your UAL would go away.
Yes.
So when you look at the numbers in terms of orders of magnitude in that same safety table, you'll see that your UAL number as a dollar value is somewhere around, let's say on average, 20 million a year. So in theory, what the Director Lai is saying is, as you are eventually moving towards not accruing unfunded accrued liability, right? Because we're paying everything off with our normal costs, with our proactive and more conservative, as well as the PARS benefit, that UAL number will eventually start to shrink. And so in theory, as that shrinks, then your normal cost will be a constant. And so that will help you reduce the percentage of payroll.
Right. And I get that concept. I was just wondering about rough magnitude, but
So-
to your point of the normal cost and the unfunded liability, the UAL number is a lot bigger than the normal
Exactly.
cost. So hence the percentage. So I see how the math works. I was just
Yep.
curious what we could expect once we get rid of that UAL line. Perhaps.
If
Yes. Well, let's hope when. I'll stop there and give Chair Bird a chance because I need to organize. I think I have a couple more, but I don't have them handy at the
That's okay.
moment. Thank you.
Let's see, a couple things. On page 5 of the report, under the second bullet is refers to, it says, if all actuarial assumptions were realized through the amortization timeline, the city would eliminate its unfunded pension liability after making these annual payments. But it doesn't say when. Doesn't that have a projected date that would occur?
2036.
So I think up above here, this is just kind of the definition. And I think Matt, you can chime in on this, but for the actuaries, the report has a variety of, maybe Matt, you could speak to it. I'm not going to try to take a turn at this because I was going to explain the base and the chart for amortization, but I think that's too granular.
Yeah. The easiest thing to look at is the amortization schedule and alternatives page for each of the reports. And that will actually show you, according to the existing schedule, when the last payment is supposed to be made. So for example, I'm looking at the miscellaneous plan right now, and it has a scheduled last payment in 44.
Okay. That gives me a sense of that. Okay. And then we have both the section 115 and the accelerated contribution. Can you remind me on our accelerated contribution and show where that's having its impact on, we break out the impact of the section 115 and we have a dollar amount and a percentage. But what about the accelerated contribution? Where do I find that?
Oh.
First, remind me how much accelerated we are these days. It's been,
So I believe Councilmember Paul Harper, Office of Management and Budget, I believe you're speaking about the same thing. The 115 trust is our accelerated funding to fund our unfunded liability.
oh, it's one and the same. I thought it was also this, that we were picking a lower rate of return and
So that's the lower rate of return that we budget, that the difference between that and
that's what's
the-
driving the section 115. Okay,
Correct.
they're one and the same. Sorry. Okay, and then on the percent of payroll, we have, depending on whether it's miscellaneous or safety. So if we go to say to slide 6, I was recalling previously, I don't know if it was in this report previously, but we had a retrospective period, and we don't have it here. So that my recollection was that this 2025 on the percentage basis was the peak. And it still seems to be on the miscellaneous, but we see the safety starts going back up again. And I don't remember what the prior peak was on safety, because it's just from here going forward. So what I'm trying to get at is for years we had said, okay, we're going to start seeing a period at which our percentages go down. And now it doesn't look like it continues that way, at least on the safety. So do we have any kind of explanation of what's driving it to go back up?
Yeah, when you talk about the safety, I mean, it's primarily being driven by the ramp up of the investment loss from the prior year.
Okay. But I thought we had kind of a long-term decline that we were on. And so I get that we kind of get that. It's been very choppy the last few years, from way over projected to way under projected, or I don't know if projected's even way over the average, projected average, to way under the projected average. But I thought it was also on a long-term decline trend. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Can you go back one slide, the one right above? So, Chair, you're recalling that we had this projection of a decline in the percentage of payroll, but I think here you'll see in this table the losses or the returns under the target for those 2 years. So in 2020, it was under by 2.3%. And in 2022, that big loss there of 12.9%, that's a big setback, which is what Matt's talking about.
Yeah.
So CalPERS has a 5-year ramp up to accelerate early contributions to that. And then there's a 20-year amortization. So you see that in table 2, because as you note, the safety percentage does ramp up and then it starts to level a little bit. And a lot of it pivots off of this negative 12.9% in that third column.
So to kind of put that into dollars, Chair, in say 2025, for that investment loss, we were paying 1.5 million. Next year in 2026, we're going to pay 2.5 million. And we've still only realized 40% of what your annual essentially debt payment is going to be. So that you went up $1 million just year over year. So that's going to keep going up over the 5-year period, and then it'll hold steady for 20. So I think you're probably recalling many reports much prior to the kind of COVID period. And so as different basis years or years of experience become under our belt, as the Director Lai said, and we do these ramp up periods, that's why those percentages of payroll are not necessarily changing. And so if you want to know, the gearheady details, those tables are in the actuarial reports. And so you actually can see, almost looks like a debt schedule. You can see each of the issuances, how far along they are and kind of where they're going. But that loss is super big.
Well, yeah, although with this FY 24 number of 9.3%, it works out to just a tad better than the target over a 5-year period. I don't know. I thought I looked at the numbers and that's what it showed. We were, if you look at, add your negatives together over
Yeah.
the target investment return versus the years where it exceeded it, including 9.3, which would exceed it by 3.5%.
Right.
2.5. Then it takes us just a tad above. target.
Right. And so I was simply using, I guess, that one kind of difference as an example. You'll see that that happens in a number of the basis years. As another example, our year ending June 2020, we still haven't fully realized all of those losses. We're only at 80%. So when you tally all of those, we're still negative on the safety in terms of
Well,
those.
through
additional
this period,
payments.
I'm looking at the next period and
Oh, I see what you're saying.
saying that if you put that 5-year period, then it takes us right about where the target was. And we'll see something a little better, but that's the way it looks. I don't know
Maybe
what
you
that
could
means,
look at the
but-
pension modeling tool later.
I
if you want
think
to.
also it might have to do with actual payroll as well.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to get a better understanding of. If we're over a 5-year period, so the report we see next year, wouldn't it come in about like it was originally projected? And yet we're seeing, unless these outlying years are adjusted downward to any significant degree, we're seeing that it's going up, even though over that 5-year period, it's about what was targeted. And the other thing is that when we revise these numbers, we aren't getting to see first, that those trailing years, but we also aren't getting to see what were our previous projections 5 years ago or whatever. What did we think was going to happen versus what has happened? And I find that really valuable in our strategic planning. Because we keep getting, well, here's our revision. Nope. And then we got another revision, but we don't have that context.
Sure. We do that on the every 4-year basis, that deeper dive. As part of that review, staff will look both historically as well as prospectively at in a much deeper level with the various modeling scenarios. And actually run additional actuarial analysis during those years. So I think that's we're in
I'm
a
just
off
thinking
year.
of cut and paste what was in previous reports so that we can just have that context.
Yep.
Okay. Think. Yeah, that covers all my questions.
I have one more. if
Sure.
that's- Yes. I'm just curious about our confidence in reaching our 90% funded status by fiscal year 2036. And I take some encouragement by the recent actuary analysis that's cited in the staff report, projecting that we'll meet 90% funded goal by FY 2034 for the miscellaneous plan and 2036 to 37 for the safety plan. And it cites our practice of using our one-time savings and how we could maybe even get there sooner. So I'm just, guess what I'd like to hear you think out loud about is, none of us have a crystal ball, but just, what is our confidence? What can we do to maximize that outcome? What should we worry about tripping us up and getting there? Just how we want to get there. What should we worry about and what should we push on?
Yeah, no, excellent question. I wish I had a crystal ball. I know this agency has been very proactive with its employee benefit policy, namely the retiree health and pension, both. And so the accelerated funding that we have in these trust funds and the level we have funded is effective. The trade-off always is if we contribute more to this, we can't fund other services or other priorities, right? So that's always going to be the trade-off. I think council has a sound policy in that every 4 years, we're going to relook at this and say, okay, these were the objectives we had previously. How are we tracking towards those objectives? Are those still good objectives for us to modify or do we need to do something differently, right? And in those 4-year cycle, we'll also do a deeper dive to see if we are going to be able to reach the 90% goal within the 15 years. Council has an opportunity always at each year end as we look at any savings we might have from general fund to contribute towards that. So absent of these 4-year deep dive policy cycles and actuarial cycles, we can also make more contributions every 12 months as well, which is what the council does.
Right. And that's what the staff report cites here. But, to just read these couple of sentences I cited, it looks pretty good, right? It looks pretty rosy because it says, one of them's a couple years ahead, the other's on track. And then we could get there even sooner if we use these one-time funds. So that sounds pretty rosy. And I just want to know, there's often things that you would caution us about. And if there are any, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I don't mean to imply it's rosy in that if we, I think the second paragraph and the second sentence is merely just saying that should we contribute more of one-time savings towards it, we can pay down liability more. That's just, that was the intent of what was being conveyed there.
Councilmember, are you asking what are some of the risks we may face that would steer us off course?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at this, I feel pretty good. Like we're just going to keep cruising and get there because it says we're, already on track, if not sooner, based on the actuary analysis. And then we can also pay it down to get there even sooner. That's great.
Sure.
And so, yes, I'm just looking at.
Yeah. I wouldn't say these are all necessarily, frankly, most of them are perhaps not in the council's control, but of course there are risks associated with any of these. Obviously, investment earnings is a huge one. So how's the economy doing? Are we meeting the investment goals or not?
Witness 21% minus 6%.
I mean, yeah, if we could get 20% every year, I'd say I think you're going to do great on reaching the 90%. Other factors can contribute to the liability calculation. So the ALM study that Director Lai referenced, CalPERS is going to look at things like the cost of healthcare, the cost or the longevity, frankly, what's mortality rates. And those are the kinds of things, assumptions that can increase our liability. Let's say current mortality rates are at 80 years old, and in the next ALM study, let's go really drastic and say, you know what, they're now 90. We're expecting everybody to live 10 years longer. Your liability is going to go up because all of your retirees are going to add 10 more years to their life, and you'd have that much more in terms of pension. So there are things that are out of your control in terms of things that could impact this. Other things that we do have obviously local control is the rate or the discipline of our pre-funding of things. Some level of kind of how we recruit and retain employees. Our salary growth is another variable that comes in with this. When you look at salary growth compared to the wage assumptions in the CalPERS reports, I don't necessarily mean a COLA. I mean salary growth as both merit, steps, MOUs, MOAs, and those kinds of things. So just the whole structure. Headcount is another thing that can impact. So the more you increase headcount or as you decrease headcount, certain numbers are going to stay the same. So that'll impact that percentage of your salary basis. So I think all of those are variables that could impact your ability to reach the goal long term. And so part of that routine monitoring and then deeper dive is why we set the structure up this way to help us keep an eye on those variables.
Gotcha. And it's the ALM studies that keep the eye,
The ALM is a
I
study
mean, sorry,
that
the actuary analysis that happens, and now we're syncing them up with the ALM studies.
Correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, because it talks about the next study, the next ALM study being released in fall 2025, but yet in FY 2023, council did reduce the discount rate from 6.2 to 5.3. And so that's the kind of thing we'll have from time to time to try to keep us on that 90% goal. Is
Mm.
we can adjust that, and you all will help us understand these reports so we can do that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Couple follow-ups. Thinking through a couple of these factors that you mentioned, and I've been wanting to ask about one of them, but medical costs. But are we affected by that, given that we have a separate fund for medical, right?
we do. We have a SERP account. Matthew could probably, I guess I was just talking about longer term, just I think about SERP as well as pensions
Okay, but
similarly.
the medical is not literally tied to this, right? Lifespan is, but
Lifespan is, Matthew, you'd be able to help us understand some of the kind of core actuarial data points that are used when you look at from an ALM perspective that would impact our calculations for liabilities.
Yeah, well, so there are two things that go on during that time period. We do the ALM and we also do the experience study. So the experience study is looking at longevity factors, other assumptions, termination rates, things like that. And those are a core part of the liability numbers. But the ALM study is primarily focused on like capital market assumptions and determining if those need to be revised and what impact that will have on what candidate portfolios that we choose, and then also the expected investment returns of those portfolios. So yeah, that's the primary purpose of the ALM.
and just on the issue of lifespan, is there a built into the formula a projected increase in lifespan that has been a long-term trend, or are we locking in just the current lifespan and using that on a forward basis?
So they try to use projections for how mortality will evolve over time. I mean, it's highly uncertain. I mean, the big question that has come up recently is how are we going to make use of numbers from the COVID time period? Whether that's a permanent increase in mortality or it was just a temporary thing and it's not going to affect our numbers in the long run. I'm not currently involved in that process, and we're just beginning the experience study, so I'm not sure what determinations they've made as to how that will be handled. I know it's a big question in the actuarial community about what those numbers actually represent.
But in general, we don't use the current life expectancy. We're using a long-term projected increase in life expectancy, right?
Yeah, I think there's an adjustment for mortality improvement. So I haven't worked on that particular decrement, but I believe they make an adjustment for expected mortality improvement.
Got it. And then I am really interested in the impact of the number of employees, because with our RENA housing numbers, we could see an increase in population of over 20%, nearly 25% in the housing supply, but they're probably not going to be the same number of residents per unit in the smaller units that are tending to get built. So somewhere in between 20 and 25% if we build that many units. So to serve those employees, and we have staffing that serves workers and residents, but the higher cost and headcount is toward residents. What's the impact of having significantly more workers on the payroll for that sort of reason.
Do you want me to comment on
Anybody who can.
it? Yeah, I mean, in general, like you're not going to expect any change in your normal costs from new employees. I mean, obviously from additional payroll, like assuming that there are no additional changes to your amortization schedule, like your unfunded accrued liability would be a smaller percentage of payroll. So that would be the simplest expectation that you could make from that.
Council member, there's a mortality rate sensitivity table in the actuarial report. If you're curious, the impacts that has. The study actually has that detailed for the inquisitive mind.
I was just gonna follow up on the chair's comments about the increased population and increased staffing and et cetera. Because I'm just looking at the long-range financial forecast paragraph in the staff report on, I guess it's page 12, but it talks about projecting the city's financial outlook over the next 10 years based on current city council approved service levels and several alternative scenarios. So I guess the idea is if we could bake into the alternative scenarios, this projected increase in population and then attendant service levels from the city that would be expected, that would seem to possibly be a place to do that.
We could take that information, but that's not how we've built our long-range financial forecast before. It's been derivatives of the base budget relative
Yeah,
to
but we haven't
revenue
had this kind of
sensitivity.
Growth projection since the 1960s.
So Matt, I think it might be good for us to talk offline because I did ask you previously about increases in headcount. I think your answer tonight is it will affect it as the normal cost component should be the same, right? So when we hire somebody, the costs we assume as a percentage of payroll should be mostly focused on the normal cost side. But I think what I'm hearing from the committee is you want us to factor in a ramp up in staffing.
Well, I would think that could at least be one of the quote, several alternative scenarios in a long range financial forecast.
Yeah, we would have to definitely think through what those assumptions would be because it's really looking in the crystal ball as to what that staffing level looks like. And what portfolio of positions we're looking at as well. So let us take this feedback into consideration.
But I think it's important. We making projections based on essentially current staffing when we're seeing a likelihood of significant increase in population and staffing doesn't seem like the right baseline.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we, as a city, have a goal to be compliant, you know, we have this housing element. If we do what we say we're gonna do, I don't know how we don't have a more than just linear increase in staff and thus affecting this. So I think we'd at least like to see some best guess at that modeled as one of the scenarios.
Well, or maybe two variations at,
Yeah, I just want to make sure we stay to the conversation of the CalPERS report because the long range financial forecast, there are more nuances just aside from the expenditure side because there's also revenue assumptions associated with that growth. But I think I want to respect how this item was agendized, and I think we've heard some of your thoughts on the matter. So if that's okay.
yeah. We no, but we do need to vote on it.
I'll make a motion to accept the report.
Yeah, I will second it and all in favor,
Aye.
Passes unanimously.
All right.
2-0
Look at that.
with one absent.
2-0.
All right. And then upcoming meetings, you want to review those?
Yes. Sure. The October 1st would be our next Finance Committee meeting that actually has a conflict with the Chamber of Commerce Athena Awards. And so we will be canceling that meeting.
Oh, that's the same date.
Yep. Conflict. Yep. So we will be canceling the October 1st meeting. So our next meeting will be on October 15th.
And remind us of the agenda items?
Do you remember?
Yes, we have tentatively coming back to you with the parking fund, parking permit program status update. It was a referral previously, so staff will be bringing back updates on that and providing you some information related to parking.
Okay. So that's the one known item at this time. All right. Thank you. On that note, we're adjourned.